Hello, this is Dr. Frank Wildman, and we're going to have a little discussion. And this is going to be a discussion in the Eugene, Oregon Feldenkrais Training Program, which is now at its last segment of a 4-year-long journey. So let's just begin with things that I think might intrigue people in terms of psychological processes that we might not be aware of, because the way our brain is constructed makes it very difficult to be fully aware of your unconscious mind. You see, your unconscious mind does things like, just as a good example, you look at something and it takes photons and converts them into neurological electrical signals, and that gets converted in your brain into images. How bizarre, because you don't have to think about doing it at all. You just look at something and it happens for you. It's all unconscious. And if you try to interfere with it, it'd be very difficult to, but, it wouldn't work. So, like vision, many, many things in our life are ruled by our unconscious mind. And I thought the best way to start thinking about it might be to talk about, when did that begin? When did we begin to believe that there was an unconscious mind? So if you go back to ancient cultures, what we know is that there was a mythology that existed. And so people, for example, some people think it's primitive, but it might be very accurate for somebody to dance like an eagle, right? And be asserted as an eagle person, or a cave bear person, or whatever it is that would hold together the tribe and have each member of the tribe psychologically interface and contribute to other members of the tribe. Because there wouldn't have been in ancient times, and certainly not in Paleolithic times, there probably wouldn't have been a sense of an isolated self. There wouldn't have been such a thing. So you would have only seen yourself in relationship to the tribe and the needs of the tribe. So that allowed many different characters to have very strong expressions of themselves, right? Because they weren't expressing themselves, they were expressing aspects of human culture as they knew it, which may have been known by 50 people in a tribe. And that was it. And then as things progressed and developed, we became more rational. And people became so rational in the days of René Descartes, Immanuel Kant, so rational that there was a belief that took a hold of all of the West and some of the East, that everything you did was rational, that you could understand yourself rationally. Now we know that's not true, but it's taken a long time to convince people that that's not true. That in fact our unconscious motives may be stronger than our conscious intentions. Our unconscious mind is perhaps much, much bigger than we had thought it was. So I'd like to just talk a little bit about a difference that we need to understand between the words sense, and we could just write this down, that would be good. Maybe write it so it goes sense down to feelings. Wherever. It's on the side. That may be a little on the side here. Yeah. So we have sensations. Right? Sensation would be the best. Right? Sense is a sensation. It's not a feeling. So a good example would be, I sense that my heart's beating faster, and I sense this strange queasiness in my stomach, and maybe the feeling I'm having, right, with those sensations, maybe the feeling I'm having is some sort of anxiety, right? So sensations build up and are organized often into feelings, but a feeling and a sensation are different, right, in that way. My skin is itching. My skin is itching all over. I feel like I've got ants under my skin. I really need to relax. What can I do? Right? So those sensations can drive a person mad, but there's a feeling behind it that's organized, which is like, I have to do something about this. This is terrible. What can I do? How can I have a feeling that's clear behind this? It just feels like I'm going crazy. Or this sensation of my chest being really open and soft. It's kind of strange and unusual, but it's really like as if if I breathe, I just feel more. And I feel really connected to people that I know, and I feel like for lack of a better way of thinking of this, like I love them more. It's an incredible sensation, but the feeling is I'm open and in a very warm place, and it feels sometimes like love. Right? So sensations of all kinds in your body can be sort of titrated out into a feeling. So sensation to feeling, and then let's just go right away to the next one, so you don't have to jump back and forth and go that goes down. You can make a little arrow maybe, or something, and that goes down to emotion. So what's an emotion? Right? It's not a feeling. You might have all kinds of feelings. I'm really pissed. I am so angry. Right? Strong feeling. But to emote that feeling means you have to put it in motion. In other words, you have to act it out. You have to have follow through on the feeling. So you can have many feelings, but your emotions are probably more limited in terms of the range of expression compared to the range of the feeling. Yeah? So it's one thing to go, oh, I just feel so angry. I feel the blood rushing up my back. I feel this tense feeling in my arms. And, well, okay, you're having a feeling. It's unpleasant if you don't act it out, actually, right? Maybe I'll go to the gym and hit a punching bag. What a relief. I've discharged something. It feels like I've discharged something. But you actually just put your feeling into an emotional expression. Maybe I'll go find that person who makes me feel awful that way, makes me so angry, and I'll confront them and talk to them about this really directly and let them know how I feel, right? Let them know how I feel. But you're putting it into motion. You're talking to somebody about it. You've organized your movements to go towards them and talk about it. So that's the feeling. Often we don't know we're having the feeling while we're emoting. We don't know. It's very hard. For example, you can tune in and go, oh, my sensation of my right leg is that it's longer than the left leg. I feel open in the chest. All that you can tune into. You can tune into the feelings you're having too. Maybe it's harder. It's harder because your feelings might make you feel very uncomfortable. Right? You have very uncomfortable feelings. So, but emotions, while you're actually acting them out, we're usually aware of the action, not the emotion. The action is, not the emotion. I hate to refer again to Muhammad Ali, but what he used to do that was really scary to his opponent would be something actually quite easy to do. But he was fast enough that he could get away with it. He'd take his left arm, his jab arm, and he'd put it slowly right in the person's face. And it was too strange. And sometimes you go, just like that, just a little knocks, nothing serious at all. And you go, open, you're too open, man. It's like, suddenly, his opponent realized he was acting like a boxing coach and instructor, which made them feel much more anxious if they actually had to fight with him. So they get distracted by having the anxious tension they were having. They couldn't coordinate things as well. So he just decided by the fifth round he was done. Over. Very clever. So he figured another way to put his feelings that he had of anxiety and fear and turn them around into complete dominance in the emotion he was expressing, right? So he created an emotion not based on his feelings really, but confluent in the opposite way with his emotions. I feel really anxious, and I'm going to go like this and tell you you should be anxious. So there's all kinds of ways that we can emotionally express, manage our feelings. Yeah? So I thought what we could do, just briefly, I want to be able to have people ask questions or stop along the way, because the next step is another big step. Is this clear? Or not? Going once. Going twice. Okay, go on. Oh.
So I'm confused about the wording. So is a feeling anger and the emotion also anger but acted out anger?
It's the expression of the feeling,
So the expression of
which
the anger.
requires movement,
Okay.
right? Which means you have to have no longer just you're internally feeling angry, but you now have an orientation, right, to your anger, because you're expressing it to somebody or in some way. And so your orientation is involved, your movements of your body, your posture is involved. It's no different than an FI lesson. All these things precede what you're going to do with your hands. Right? So, is that clear? Is that more clear? So, historically, how did this notion about our unconscious mind, how did this begin? So, again, at one time, we had the mythology, and then we had hyper-rationality that occurred after the Renaissance in Europe, and then we take it further, mathematics and hard sciences, as they call it, mathematics and physics presented as something really, this was real science. They could prove something with this and measure it. The important thing is to be able to measure it and prove it. And so there's a man named, a philosopher named Charles Peirce, who I'm sure would have gotten along well with Feldenkrais. And he was truly a genius. And during his life, he wrote 12,000 pages of written work. And most people don't even know about him. But he's the actual originator of the philosophy of pragmatism. And pragmatism was very American. It wasn't European, right? It was American. So he's the first philosopher in the New World that really, in some way, changed the world. So there was a group of philosophers, mathematicians, scientists in the late 19th century, right, the late 1800s, that developed notions that somewhere inside of you, you had some force that was not rational, and it could be measured scientifically. Now, we'll talk about two things. The first one, Charles Peirce was on a ship. And on this ship, someone stole his wallet and a piece of jewelry that was expensive. And it was embarrassing to the captain of the ship, so he called the crew forth and had them stand in line and have Peirce look at them. And he wasn't sure he saw anybody. So what good did that do, right? I mean, you didn't see the person steal it, so why have a police lineup? And he just looked at it. They all looked the same. They all looked, just different people, but it had no relationship to the theft. And so the captain of the ship said, what if you just walked away for a little while and come back and just pick somebody? It's okay, we won't charge them with anything. He says, okay, if you don't charge them with anything, because I might, of course, have the wrong person, I'll do it. And he just directly walked over to this one person and said, him. And they searched his room, and he had the jewelry and the wallet. And so he then went, who did that? Consciously, I have no idea. How did I know? What enabled me to know? Then he got involved with a couple of people, called one of which is you've probably heard of, Weber and Fechner. Yeah? The originator of the Weber-Fechner laws. And the Weber-Fechner laws was an attempt to measure pressures and weights so that you could make distinctions of how hard you were working and how much effort it took to perform a fixed amount of work. Yeah? So like lifting something up is a fixed amount of work. You can measure it, so much weight over a certain distance. Measurable, right? Scientific. Effort, well, how could you measure that? By observation? But what kind of effort? How much? How can you measure it? So they did it very scientifically with vision, by seeing if there was an alteration of just one candle in a room with 200 candles. It was late 19th century, so candles were, then the person might detect, it was at the threshold of detection, right? One candle power with 200. Okay, you could measure that. So could we measure through pressure on the skin? Could a person detect how much weight was pressing on his skin? You just laid weights on the skin. How much, they can see it, but just, okay? Now, they change that weight, right? Until the person would go, okay, it weighs more, right? Or it weighs less, right? That they could detect a difference. They did this with hundreds of people, Fechner and Weber. And they then, scientifically, they wrote a paper that was published, and they basically are credited with scientifically establishing that there was an unconscious mind, because the person would guess how much weight and is it more and is it less? And there's no way that you could see it. You had to go by the feeling, but they tested it so that the person's ability to feel went beyond what we know, or they knew, as the threshold of detection. In other words, it should have been not feelable. They shouldn't have been able to feel it, see it, or hear it. They did it in 3 senses. How did they do it? When people said, it's more or less, they were right 75% of the time. So 50% would have been a guess, right? 75% is pretty good. If you were in the stock market, that would be great. Right? So they published papers, and are now, these initial papers are considered the beginnings of a new psychology. What was then a new psychology, which emerged in the late 18th century. Late 19th century and the late 1800s, and a little bit into the last century. Suddenly, Harvard University had a new department, and it was called a psychology department. Wow, the study of the psyche. There wasn't much to study before that in the psyche. There was no idea that your psyche had a tremendous power of observation and could make huge distinctions, lead to different kinds of actions. Everybody thought, well, it's all rational. It's all organized, perfectly by your conscious, intentional mind. Let's take it to this method. I want to push through someone's head or lift their head. That's my intention. I'm going to sit myself down in the best way possible. I'm going to study, okay? We'll do it this way. I'll lift their head, and I should know what I'm doing. Well, actually, you almost can't. Because probably you'll have mixed motives. You'll have what Feldenkrais called cross motivations. I want to lift their head and detect a change, but in fact, the change might be too subtle and I can't detect it. I can only guess. But you'll probably guess right. That it's heavier now or it's lighter now. Things are changing. Rolling the head is different now than before. Things are changing. And to be able to feel that isn't necessarily something available to you consciously. But if you guessed, you'd probably guess it right. Your unconscious mind has to be more precise and more accurate than your conscious mind. It has to be. Habits build the structure of the brain. Habits build the structure of the brain for the survival of the species. I better go. Right? Friend or foe? Friend? Okay. How do you know? You can't know. But some part of you might know. They took a man who had damaged his brain quite seriously in an accident, and he lost the visual centers in his occipital lobe in his brain. So he was blind. Although all of the network of images, right, the eyeballs were fine, his retina was fine, the neurons going back to the occipital lobe were fine, just there was nothing back there that was operational anymore. after a very severe stroke. And they studied this guy. They thought, oh, good, he's got everything working, but he can't see. So they studied him, and they found out that if he was walked through a corridor, he seemed to be doing quite well. So they thought, let's put boxes and a book here and a glass over here, right? All these things, and just say, could you walk through this corridor? Well, he did. He negotiated his way perfectly, but he couldn't see. But what he could do, this is kind of interesting, he could recognize faces if he looked at them long enough. But he didn't recognize faces in the ordinary way that we might think. He just could look at them and know what their emotional expression was. Because that was the most critical thing for you to see in your life. Right? It's the first thing. Mama. Right? So survival depends on very quick decisions. How to get out of the way. When to jump, when to not jump. When to run, when not to. Right? And your unconscious mind decides for you. You don't have to think about it or how to arrange yourself to run. You can learn new things, which we do here, and by making them very conscious, and then it sinks into what we would call subliminal learning. Subliminal learning is mostly what you're doing here. Most of what you might fret about or think should be conscious, that you know you've learned something because it's very conscious, is a false way of thinking. There's no basis to it. Well, thank you. So, after the new psychology, which is no longer a new psychology at all, but at the time, that legitimate study of the brain and studying irrational features of the brain and running experiments to try to understand how profound the unconscious was, how large it might be, how irrational we might really be. Along came a new thing, not psychology, but psychiatry. It was belonged to the realm of medicine, and it was called the talking cure. In the talking cure, you had a patient lying down right on a couch, a divan actually, and the therapist, for example, Dr. Freud, would sit here, and the person would just freely associate. He might ask questions to direct it away in a certain way, right? But otherwise, no interference. He would just write down in his notes what the person was talking about. And then he realized the person's lying. He realized that most of his clients were lying. They had repressed many, many memories. And then I think I once mentioned this as an example. I'll mention it again. He made a very dramatic case when a wealthy young woman, she was about 20 years old, from a big Swiss family, came to see him for therapy. And the problem was her hand was paralyzed. Remember me talking about this once? No? Okay, it's all right. It's in there. Unconsciously, it has to be in there somewhere. I did it again, sorry. So you see, you can't have a hand that's paralyzed. The nerve networks don't operate that way, and they knew that at the time already, right? So you could have the ulnar nerve or the radial nerve, either this is paralyzed all the way up, or this is paralyzed all the way up this way. That's how you would be paralyzed. So to have nothing paralyzed here, fully functioning arm, elbow, everything, wrist, but have your hand just dead, atrophied, right? So ugly looking that she covered it up always with a black glove, which is an interesting choice of colors. And so she came to him and they did the talking cure, and he realized that she was lying. He just felt she's lying. She's not telling me what caused this paralysis. It has to be psychological. It doesn't, because your nerves don't work that way. How is she doing this? How is something called the unconscious mind paralyzing her? And after many, sessions of finally it came down to the fact that she was terribly ashamed and guilty, both, of the fact that since she became a teenager, she masturbated and always used the same hand. And she always felt terrible about it and thought she was sick. really sick and almost evil. But she picked up the habits of her Swiss family. And so her brain found a way to punish her and stop the activity, all at the same time, by paralyzing her hand. As soon as she realized this, by talking about it, nothing more than talking about it, it went away, almost like overnight. And it took a short time to get the muscular actions back. If you atrophy something, you can get it back very quickly. And, she went on her merry way. Freud wrote about this, and of course he was ridiculed. This is impossible. This is as if the unconscious mind is more powerful than our conscious mind. That's ridiculous. He couldn't get it published. Finally it was published, and then he got more ridicule. Because if this is true, it's kind of like, it takes away all these things that have been taken away since the beginning of science. It makes us further from God. It makes us less in control of our lives. We find out that we're going around the sun, and it's not going around us. That's bad enough. Then we find out we don't have a flat earth, but it's a big, big ball, and we can't even see that. Too much. And then somebody comes along and says, oh, I'm sorry, but your unconscious mind is really ruling your behavior. So let's see what this does we mentioned the stock market as a guessing game, right? So some really interesting research has been done where they studied what actually generates successful stock activities. And of course, stock market people are very big, and there's a lot of economists they're very rational, right? It's all very, very almost mathematical, and it's so they really looked at all kinds of different things. And what they found is that when it was raining in New York City, the stock exchange went down. When it was sunny in New York City, the stock exchange went up. The stocks went up. And if you did nothing more than paid attention to weather in New York, and you bought stocks on those days, over a period of 1 year, you'd have a return of 28%. If you bought on rainy days, you would lose 8%. Amazing, huh? That might be the key indicator of all indicators. And stockbrokers have looked at everything. But it's just too hard to admit that it was that out of their control. Infuriating, to have that, oh my God. What does that make of my job? What does that mean? So then, to go another step further, Freud, who didn't start the idea of the unconscious mind in any way, right? These are the people I was talking about, who Fechner, Weber, they're the ones who made the study of the mind something scientific, incredible, right? It was something credible. All those things were accepted. So, Freud was a researcher, very much. He took a lot of cocaine and other drugs to see what effects they would have on him, and then he prescribed them. He experimented every way possible. Anthropological thing, he's just a genius that way. Last thing he did was this talking cure, right? The talking cure. There was no other name for it. But he developed an idea that what's repressed in people is civilization itself. Civilization requires, in order for buildings to be built, for the trains to run on time, for all of your life to operate smoothly, you had to have a harmony between your conscious mind and your unconscious mind. And you had to have something above or beyond unconscious desires. So, he developed a tripartite notion. And we could just put that next to these, like one connected to the other, starting with the superego on top. The superego was your cultural background. It was your specific cultural and family background, maybe your religion, all the things that are a result and consequence of your culture. Advertising. Freud's nephew basically developed public relations and ads. We talked about that in here once, right? And I recommended you watch The Century of the Self. And he just used his uncle's notions. And so, superego, sorry, down to ego, and then down to id. So where we'll start just here in the id was something completely different than what we have today in discussions about something called the new unconscious, which is what many researchers today are working with through fMRIs. fMRIs have really blown apart a lot of theories, but they haven't completely blown this apart yet. So the idea is that in your id is represented by Freud as a seething, boiling cauldron of lust, anger, irrational fears and irrational beliefs, just a cauldron of danger and great pleasure. So, is that going to rule the world? So he thought, no. The id is really out of control. So we have to keep a lid on the id. That's my version of it. It's not Freud's. But that has to be kept controlled. How to do it? By a superego. A superego is all, again, your cultural background, right? All your cultural background, where you learn how to behave, right? You learn how to behave. You even learn what you're supposed to think, right? And you have subliminal messages that are pouring out all the time as to how to live. Like, how should you behave in a training program? I mean, who's to say how? Nobody explicitly teaches you how, but you learn eventually, you lie on your back, and you can feel the floor, and then you'll have a lesson, and there's certain things that you do. Like people have to learn culturally how to go to a movie. I went to a movie some years ago in Italy just to go to one with a friend, and it was amazing because the Italians they were talking during the movie, they were saying, they'd cry at that scene. It was just amazing. So they were all emotionally expressing themselves. So you could hardly hear the movie. I asked my friend, what are they saying? He said, I don't know, I can't hear. This is Yadir. Whereas we learn a different way of attending a movie. And in Scandinavia, it's a deadly quiet at a movie. Nobody expresses themselves at all. So these cultural things, he felt, created a kind of a sandwich, right? You have the id down here feeding upwards, and the superego that you have unconsciously also, right? They're both unconscious. Most people don't understand what they've learned subliminally through their culture. So in the middle, between your attempt to control the id, but let some of it through, because it's your life force. It's also your vitality is expressed in the id. So the seething, boiling cauldron has to be managed. Managed. The superego has to be managed, so you're not just dictated to by your leaders. Right? That probably was best expressed years after Freud came up with this in the rise and fall of the Third Reich. Highly rational people. Germans are very rational. They're very nice that way, actually. Very good. They enjoy themselves. They let their id out frequently at parties. Really, I like Germans. But where that hyper-rationality, the superego, went, was very destructive. Right? It tried to just integrate by forgetting the ego and just manage the power of the id and its expression and let it loose and organize it really tightly so it could be expressed through the rigidity and rationality of the superego. Not healthy. So Freud believed that you developed your ego. What is your conscious mind? The things you really can honestly say, I feel this, I know this because I sense it, and I feel it, and I can act it out. Yeah? I can put it into action. That's something that you develop by a stronger and stronger ego. So if you have a strong enough ego, you don't have to worry about being crushed by your superego of culture or just led into irrationality and onto panic through your id by taking the lid off your id. Some people need a lid off their id, right? It's like almost, you just sense it. Some people are so stuck in their culture and they're a little rigid. And you wish they would let a little id out. And some people are so wildly, it's like, God, come on, can you develop a superego, please? Can you control yourself? So this is now a model that's been there for over 100 years. And of course it's changed, which we'll talk about in the next talk. But this is kind of a background, I hope, for you to understand where psychology started, how it started, because it started with very similar things that we do all the time, right? Can we feel less effort, more effort, how much effort? It's an experiment. Every session is an experiment. And what happens if you step into a person's, the superego processes, their will, and you bypass their will? Is that healthy? Probably. Yeah. You're learning to move and to sense, to feel, maybe to emote. But it's not dangerous, right? You go in the way Feldenkrais felt, the way to your unconscious mind and a way to your higher consciousness, more awareness of your unconscious mind, was not to go here. Right? All of psychology today is expressed by sometimes confronting or dealing with a person emotionally, at the level of their emotions. They might cry in the session and throw things and whatever, Group sessions of some sort are really wild. And he felt that was, that's, everybody defends themselves emotionally. Your defenses go up immediately if confronted emotionally. So why try to enter the mind that way, the psyche? Feelings, you'll defend even inside of yourself. I won't cry, I won't. And I won't laugh either, right? So you might over-control yourself there. But sensation, this sensation is the royal road, he called it, right? Beginning of awareness through movement in the first few pages. The royal road to the unconscious is through sensation. Because people don't have any reason or any knowledge of how to defend themselves. They're just having sensations. They're just sensations. Whoa. They won't really affect you, right? It's just sensations. And people have no idea how much it would affect them. How much change could occur by altering your perceptions and your sensations. So, yeah, I think we should. I think so. What do you think? Yeah. Well, we have a lot of other stuff, but that's okay. This gives you a good. This is just a basic, framework to work with. Yeah. I can just end it by saying that today, since about the 1990s, 1991, 92, a lot of this has changed. We're now in a new era where fMRIs are able to detect how we think and what we perceive. And so they would say, no, you're not completely repressed. It's very specific. Your brain needs to operate in a certain way. And it needs for you to forget certain things, and it needs you to remember other things. And it doesn't mean you're psychologically weird because you forgot something. Right? It's just maybe your brain needed you to forget things so that you could operate in a different way that might be more productive for you. Yeah? So it's a kinder, gentler approach to the unconscious. Freud's work was not kind and gentle. He thought it was scary. And he predicted way back that eventually something like the Nazi Party would emerge. And it would, of course, emerge in German culture, and which he knew well. I mean, he lived in Vienna and, did most of his work in Vienna. When the Austrians, when the Nazis began, Hitler decided he wanted to incorporate Austria into the German Empire. So they simply negotiated with them. It was very peaceful. And the Nazi Party just moved in on their tanks and their armored vehicles, and thousands of people were in the streets waving flags and greeting them. They were absolutely happy. It was a very rational decision they made that this is good. So, okay. Do you have questions of any sort? It would be good to. I know it's a little late, but you might have some. Russell.
So sensations being the royal road to the unconscious makes me think about sensations and how that fits into the self-image. So would it be accurate to say that your self-image is shaped by your sensations, or it's more universal, it's shaped by all of that?
I think you can't just isolate your self-image to a sensation. No. It would be, yes, your feelings, the actions you've taken, your emotions, the way you express yourself, all of those things are part of your self-image. But you could lay on the floor, and when I was in my training program, I was really young. I was almost as young as you. and I would lay there and I'd feel your contact would go into your body and says you feel, I was just horny all the time. So, it's like, I only have one sensation, actually. And after a few days, that might go away for one day or two, but it was like, and it was hard to admit that, because I did feel slightly ashamed of feeling that way so much, because nobody else in the class would explicitly talk about that. The only person who did was Feldenkrais. He said, he was referring to the id. If you have a strong enough ego to deal with your id, then that's a good way to feel. Why not feel that way? What else is important to feel? And that's, he also felt that the way that we conduct ourselves in the world is if, for example, somebody, we were talking with Elena this morning in the group about having a baby who taught you how to do it, and he felt, well, who taught you how to have sex? Who taught you that? Who taught you how to eat? Who taught you how to swallow? How to go to the bathroom? How did you, the most critically important things in life, he felt, were subliminally learned and charged with cross motivations. Oh, digestion problems and I'm constipated all the time. Well, constipation to him was an emotional activity based upon certain feelings that my person might not have any awareness of. Right? People who got sick in the training a lot, they get a sore throat and whatever. He didn't ridicule that at all. He just wanted them to examine what might be underneath that. So, yeah. Anybody else? John?
So I think sometimes we think a lot about superego things coming from ideas and cultural norms and things like that, but it's also the extent to which we learn these things at a very, very young age through expressions of our parents and people and things like that. And I don't know, for me, I think it's always an underestimation of how big that is, and that through this work, for me, really the only way you can access maybe is through movement and sensation and things like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, might be true. I think it is. Yeah. Where this all breaks down, this whole model, where it breaks down is with phobias. Right? They're sometimes effective to do the talking cure or psychoanalysis for years to understand why you're afraid of a spider or snakes, But behavioral psychologists by the late 1950s had developed absolutely certain ways that you will not be afraid of snakes anymore or insects anymore. And it was, so they sort of laugh at this. It's like, this is an ineffective model for dealing with other really basic functions. Right? You know, the idea is, okay, there's a spider, well, let's look at a big spider on the screen. You're safe, it's on the screen. You know, you're 20 feet away from the screen at least. And then, okay, now we're going to bring it closer. Now we're going to put an image, a plastic image of a spider under a little glass jar. And you can look at it there, and you just progressively learn to control your interior so that you don't freak out. And then if you're calm enough with that, then finally they end up putting a plastic spider on your hand, and then they do it with a real spider, one that doesn't bite at all. People, I mean. and so people can go, wow, and I'm okay. You know, it's like, wow, I'm okay. And that hasn't been achieved very well through psychoanalysis. So, you know, there's many different things that are useful. So I'm not suggesting even that this should be the model that's of accuracy, but it is a model that does something the brain sciences are not doing. It's almost like there's a modern phrenology. And instead of looking for bumps on the head and skull that would indicate your moods and what parts of your brain were working, it's now done with fMRIs. And it's very interesting, all these modern discoveries. It's incredibly interesting. Wow, what power. There's an image that I maybe just sort of leave this with. fMRIs are so powerful if combined with certain computer programs that they can show someone a picture. Could be a complex picture, you know, with many people in it or whatever. Could be a simple picture with interesting architecture in it, details of architecture. And you show the person that, they take it away, they put the person in an fMRI machine and ask him to remember that picture of this group of people. Okay? Now, remember those people in the architecture. Right? Just remember that. That's all. Just remember it. Then they're done with the fMRIs. They have the recording of what they found on the fMRI, and they take that recording of the fMRI, they plug it into the computer program, which generates images. Almost always, it will generate very, very close to what the person saw in the photo. I mean, do you realize how that's like, wow. Yeah, that's awesome. But also, it's like, well, so what does that mean? You know, what do you do with that? That sure is interesting, sure seems powerful, but what do we do with it? The meaning of those things are often better done by psychologists and psychiatrists who look at these new models of the brain and find a way to use it in their professions. And the brain scientists are not interested in this model. They're techies. So they're working with psychology without having any background in it. And they're not interested, because this is an old model. And we'll talk more about that the next time. This is the 11th of June, 2014. Thank you.